Now, before winding up our meeting, we're going to invite Brother Brown back up, and this time he'll be speaking on the subject, stretching forward to the things ahead. Brother Brown, please.
All of us have a common goal, and that goal is to gain everlasting life. We've learned about God's new world. We've learned about a paradise, conditions that will exist then. And it is our desire to actually be there and see the realization of all these things. Now, the Apostle Paul liked to illustrate this with various athletic metaphors. He thought a lot about that because it was popular in his day and time, and how these metaphors, in particular dealing with running in a race, could be likened to our efforts to get into God's new world. Now, one such example is in the book of Philippians. Please turn there, Philippians chapter 3. And in verses 13 and 14, he puts forth this metaphor again to help us realize some important aspects of staying undistracted and focused in our efforts to get there. Philippians 3. Now, look at verse 13. He says, "Brothers, I do not yet consider myself as having laid hold on it, but there is one thing about it. Forgetting the things behind and stretching forward to the things ahead, I am pursuing down toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God by means of Christ Jesus." So there once again he brings into the picture this metaphor of runners in a race, a continuing race that goes on and on. So he said about himself, I don't consider myself as having laid hold on it. A race is continuous. I know it's something I'm involved in now. But he said there is, in fact, one thing about it. Likely you took note of his expression there. He said there's one thing about it. Not two, not three, not a half dozen. He said there is, in fact, one thing about it. Now, you heard his illustration there and what he had in mind. We could make that a question to think about. And since it narrows down to just the consideration of the one thing about it, then the question is obvious. What then is that one thing about it? Now, the pause was to give us time to think, settle on something, because the parallel here is a very important one. We want to gain life in God's new world. We all live now in this old world. We have our direction and commandments from God. We want to remain focused and undistracted. So what is that one thing about it? I said that a few weeks ago, and the sister said finally, I thought if he says that one thing one more time, I'll scream. I said, well, that was deliberate to make us all think about this. This was part of the way the apostle was presenting it. He said, I haven't laid hold on it yet because it was a continuing race. But he said, And you know what he said. Actually, he gave the answer there in verse 14. He says, I am pursuing down toward the goal for the prize. And in his case, the upward call of Jesus Christ. For those who will not be a part of the heavenly prize or reward, then there is the opportunity to gain everlasting life here in the earth. That is the one thing. He said it himself. He said, I'm pursuing down toward the goal. I want to be a winner. That's why I'm in this race. And that one thing is to come out victorious, to be a winner, and to get the prize, which is everlasting life. That's all that counts. And that's why he let us know so emphatically. We have to remain focused on that, winning in that race for life. And living as we do in this old world, we have to remain undistracted. Now then he gives us 2 points that we need to have in mind. The first, he said, you have to forget about the things behind. So in other words, if we're going to be a winner, if we're going to have to come off victorious and get everlasting life, he said, you're in the race, this is what you're running, so you've got to forget about the things behind. That original language word in Greek, forget is how it's translated here, really carries the thought, be unconcerned. It's a word that has various meanings and various nuances to what it is trying to convey, but it's not saying here to obliterate something from our minds, what's behind us, but it says be unconcerned about what you have passed and what is behind you. Or another way is to neglect, not giving focus and attention to that. And that's very true because, you know, there are good things and bad things that are in the past we may need to forget about. Look at the case of the Apostle Paul himself. He got the truth, and he had, from the standpoint of the world, a very illustrious past. He was somebody considered to be important, with position and prestige and the financial security offered by it. He was big in the world of Judaism and how they looked at things then. But even though that was very good, when he got a knowledge of the truth and understood how things were going to work out and that there was now this prize of the upward call by means of Jesus Christ, then he did not show concern about those things. He neglected them. These were not the things he talked about. They were no longer important to him. So, as he advises here too, he said, forget about the things behind. We may often need to do that too. Some persons had quite an unsavory past when they were in the world, and maybe to some extent it continued as they came to a knowledge of the truth. There were things they did that they are very unhappy about now. And if you talk to some and you hear their experiences, if they're willing to tell, they did some terrible things. Not long ago, a sister said, well, I was involved in the activities that a lesbian would be involved with. And I feel so bad and ashamed. It keeps cropping up. And sometimes it saps my energy. It seems I'm preoccupied with that. Another brother had in the past where he had committed a murder. Nobody really knew it, but he knew it. Another was dealing with the past that involved the child molestation. These are all horrible things, but they're in the past now. If we have come to a knowledge of the truth and dedicated our life to God, baptized in the cleansing power of the ransom of Jesus Christ, has covered these things. And so he said, don't let these things take you down. There's no need to be concerned about them now. If you've used the benefit of that ransom sacrifice, then you can truly say that you can forget about the things of the past, whether they were good things from the standpoint of the world that should bring you maybe glory and honor, or whether they were bad things and you want to move on in God's service, then that should be the important thing. And that's true with any of us. What you've done in the past, don't allow those things to pour in on you now and overwhelm you. Some do that. And it is a distraction from pursuing down toward the prize of gaining everlasting life in God's new world. Here's the problem that a runner has if they start to focus on something else, and they're in a race. If they start looking back in a foot race, and that's the kind we're talking about, then it does some things that will not be helpful to them. One, it takes their concentration off the race. And maybe they're running along at a very good clip, but it sort of interferes with their stride and their motion forward. In other words, you got to stay focused on what is at hand. If you are running a race, a foot race, and you're trying to get to the goal as someone who is victorious. So you don't want anything in there that's going to cause you to break your stride, break your concentration, lose the rhythm that you've built up in the running. Looking back can cause that to happen. Any runner can tell you that. There was a very historic race back in 1954. Some of you seated here will remember it. Others have only read about it and maybe know about it. But in 1954, for the first time in human history, a man ran the mile under 4 minutes. It had never been done by a human before. So, as a miler, he was the fastest man in the world, Roger Bannister. He was a medical student over there in England, as well as a runner. And it was quite celebrated at the time. But in less than 2 months, a John Landy ran the mile under 4 minutes, and he beat Bannister's time by 1.2 seconds. Now you had 2 men in the world that had run the mile under 4 minutes. Well, you know what everyone wanted as the newspapers hyped it up and gave the news all around the world. They said, well, this would be quite a race. Bannister up against Landy in a showdown race. And sure enough, the showdown race was set for August 7, 1954. It was to take place up in Vancouver. And there were just going to be those 2 men on the field. And they were going to do the number of laps needed to make up a mile, because it needed to be settled who's the fastest miler in the world, Bannister or Landy. 35,000 people assembled to watch the showdown up in Vancouver. so they could see how this played out. So they were off and running, and it looked like Landy was going to be the winner there, because as they got into the final 35 feet of the race, Landy was out in front. But something bothered him. In his mind, the question was, where is Bannister? Because with just two men running, you can't really see where the other runner is if he's behind you. And clearly Landy was in front. Landy could not resist the temptation. As he got into the home stretch, he turned to his left just to look around quickly and see where Bannister was. As he looked around to the left, zoom! Bannister went by him on the right, and Bannister won the race. Landy lost. Time magazine's reporter was there and was interviewing Landy after the race. Here's what Landy said to the Time reporter. He said, "If I hadn't looked back, I would have won that race." That's what we're talking about. There's a real example. A showdown race, and he admitted if he just did not yield to the temptation to look and see where was Bannister, he said he would have won. It broke his concentration momentarily. It interfered with the rhythm he had built up. He really didn't keep in mind the principle that Paul did in his athletic metaphor when Paul said, there is one thing about it. You've got to stay focused on what you're doing, the race you're in, and you have to forget about the things behind. Well, now that's a lesson for us. We're moving along now in this race for everlasting life. What we've passed, we've passed. We need to resist any temptation to look back, or we can lose our stride. Certainly with any of us, bad things have happened, good things have happened, maybe from the standpoint of where we were and what we were doing as far as the world was. But the point of the matter is, we have to stay focused on what is ahead for us. And that's why after he said, forget about the things behind, he said, stretching forward to the things ahead. Now that makes sense. And I think we've all seen that, at least as these important races and games are televised. We see when runners get near the goal, they are stretching forward with all their might. And now they're able to get these cameras close enough so you can see their face, the strain in their bodies, and their arms are outreach. It is like with everything they got, they're stretching forward to finish that race victorious. Well, that's where we are. That's why our English expression is good to describe where we are now. We're in the home stretch. Stretch. And in the home stretch, that's all we can focus on is being there out in front, keeping the place so that we can, as Paul, stay focused on what needs to be done. And that's to come off a winner and victorious. Now, what's going to help you? Well, you're running for the prize. That's how Paul put it. He named the prize that he had been called to, the upward call, going to heaven with Jesus Christ. For most of you, it's to be in God's new world. Well, if that's where you're heading, and this is the old world, then you have to see yourself in God's new world. That's what is ahead of you. And that will require visualization on your part. In other words, seeing God's new world. And not just the beautiful pictures that appear in our publications from time to time, but in the picture, you have to be in it. See, that's why they say visualization. That is the ultimate visual skill. Not very easy to construct that and put everything that would tend to be abstract to make it a reality. That's you sitting under your own vine and fig tree. That's your family. That's your friends. You see yourself there. That's what is going to help you. That's why we're told in our reading of the Bible and all to picture and see things. And if we're aiming ahead of us to finish the race a victor, then we need to see ourselves by means of visualization in God's new world. That's the problem with some. Because they're only seeing things in the sense of the reality of this old world and material things and things related to this. And even when they talk maybe about God's new world, they're talking about animals, they're talking about trees, they're talking about crops. Here, we're talking about you. That's who you need to see in God's new world. And here's the good news. It's overwhelmingly good. In that new world, Jehovah wants you there. And He's on your side. And that's the problem many are having. Maybe the reason they don't visualize it so clear in their minds is that they don't realize that it's Jehovah that wants them there. Sometimes they get overwhelmed in their shortcomings or their weaknesses, and they're looking at things, oh, I'd love to be there, but I don't think I'll ever make it. Look what I've done, and then they can go through a series of things. Oh, they may not be overwhelmingly bad or sinful things, but they may look at it, oh, I've been working on this for decades, or ever since I've been in the truth, I've had this as a bad habit. I can't seem to get over this and move on. Wrong way to think. Let me read you something right from the Watchtower. And here's what the paragraph said. However, if we are trying our best to meet God's requirements, we have every reason to be confident of attaining the reward. If we trust in Jehovah, He will help us to gain our goal. Indeed, it is contrary to His nature to search for reasons to disqualify those sincerely trying to please Him, in quotation. Now that should encourage anybody. He's not looking for things against you. He's not trying to find a reason to keep you out, or it sure would be easy enough if He focused on and looked at our weaknesses, but He said if we're trying to do our best and meet His requirements, then we have every reason to be confident that we're going to be able to obtain the prize. As a parent, did you ever give your child a gift, let's say a gift of a coloring book, and brought it home from the store and gave it to the child? It's a little daughter, and you bought a box of crayons. Look what I got you, dear. Here's a coloring book. Here's some crayons. Go color a picture. The child's enthusiastic, loves it, and goes away with the book and the crayons, comes back just a little later. I want to show you the picture, Mama, that I did. Now, you already know where this is going because you know what the picture looked like. The colors were not between the lines. You looked at the faces. They were purple. The hair was green. The landscape was yellow. And all outside of the lines appeared any old color. And the child says, here's the picture I colored. And you say, let me see. Oh, isn't that wonderful? Give me a hug. You did such a wonderful job. Thank you very much. So the child feels good. And yet you know, and I know, the coloring of that picture left a lot to be desired. But a parent was pleased because they know the limitations, they know the effort, and they praise the picture. Well, in a sense, that's how it is when it comes to our relationship with Jehovah. Maybe the product itself isn't that good, but we're trying our best. And He, as a loving parent, is going to be appreciative, and He's going to be glad because He wants you in that new world. And that's why He wants you to visualize what it's going to be like there now, as you imitate in every way that illustration of the Apostle Paul. There is one thing about it. I am pursuing down toward the goal of gaining the prize of everlasting life in God's new world.
Well, again, we thank all for being here for this wonderful activity. And, of course, we thank the Browns for their wonderful visit. We'd like to express that to them.